Hey everybody, I'm Father Jonathan. I'm the Associate Rector here at Church of the Ascension, and I am coming to you from an empty sanctuary. We are in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, and everything is shut down, including our sanctuary here. So I am here kind of all alone. I'm coming to you to talk today a little bit about this idea of spiritual communion. About 100 years ago, there was a group of ecumenical scholars drawn from Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic, Orthodox communions. And they were all studying the text of Scripture and the text of the early church fathers. And they came to realize that the Eucharist had a centrality to the congregational life of the church that had been eclipsed in the medieval and modern eras. And so participation by the congregation had been limited to a kind of sacred gazing upon the Eucharist as the priest kind of performed the rite. Or it had become downplayed as a means of grace in some Protestant churches. And so there was a massive push by these scholars to put the Eucharist again, and especially weekly or frequent reception of the Eucharist, at the center of the church's common life. And that was this tremendous gain for the church. It was, number one, a point of ecumenical agreement among communions that were otherwise divided. But the idea that Christ really came to us and was really present to us as we received this Eucharist, and that it was important for the congregation to do so as a whole and frequently, was a huge ecumenical gain. It was also a gain for galvanizing congregations and congregational participation. So tremendous gain. And so all of us, I think, at this point, don't even remember a time. If you grew up Anglican, or if you have converted to Anglicanism from some other form of Christian faith, you don't even remember a time when this wasn't normative, to have weekly communion at the center of our common life. But actually, prior to 100 years ago, morning prayer on Sunday mornings was the normative form of liturgy that would have been participated in by the congregation on Sunday mornings, with communion happening maybe once a month, once a quarter, even annually in some places. So it is this tremendous gain. And so all of us, I think, feel this aching sense of loss and sorrow when we think about not being able to gather together for worship in word and sacrament. This meal has become so critical and indispensable to our congregational life together. But I want to highlight this salient fact. Number one, that congregational worship prior to 100 years ago was morning prayer. And then also, there have been numerous seasons in the life of the church historically where the church has not been able to gather and assemble for worship on Sunday mornings, to be fed and nourished by word and sacrament. There have been times when hostile governments suppressed the life of the church and made it nearly impossible or impossible for the church to gather publicly. There have been other seasons of disease and plague. In fact, this 100-year stretch that we've just lived through, where we haven't really had any major pandemics that have shut everything down, is rare. It's actually possibly unique in the history of the church. There have been other seasons where plague has kind of shut down congregational life for some period of time. There have been other kind of more pedestrian times of suffering where, parents of small children who were very sick have not been able to come to worship and not been able to receive communion. And so what the church has counseled people to do in these seasons, knowing that the Eucharist really is at the center of the life of the church, has been to have people meditate upon the centrality of the Eucharist and to ask Jesus to be present to us when we can't gather for worship or we can't come to receive the Eucharist, to ask him to be present to us as if we were there and as if we were participating in congregational worship together. This practice is known, or this devotion is known as spiritual communion. And it's been commended by most of the saints throughout history. Teresa of Avila, for instance, has said in the 16th century that if you cannot be at Mass and you cannot receive communion, then practice spiritual communion, and it will be a great boon for your soul. Likewise, the great Polish American Catholic priest, Walter Ciszek, in the 1930s was captured by the Bolsheviks and spent the next decade in solitary confinement, or in the next decade imprisoned in a gulag, and in some part of that in solitary confinement. And during that time period, through his suffering, he was able to experience joy by the regular practice of spiritual communion. So this is a practice that has been commended by the church. It's a practice that has rewarded those who have practiced it by increasing our desire for the sacrament. It doesn't displace the sacrament. It doesn't say that it's not important to receive the sacrament and receive it frequently. What it does say is that by practicing this form of communion, what we're actually doing is engaging in a kind of lamentation that we can't be present corporally to receive this sacrament together. And saying that what this practice of lament does, this practice of meditation does, is to build in us a fervent desire for the sacrament, so that when we are finally able to return to gathered congregational worship together, our desire for it has reached a fever pitch. We've come to appreciate what we've been missing in a new way that we weren't able to do when we were able to take for granted that we would be able to gather on Sunday mornings. So I would encourage you, as we move into this season, to join us as a church in practicing spiritual communion. The prayer for spiritual communion is in our new prayer book, the 2019 Book of Common Prayer. It's occasional prayer number 106. And on Sunday mornings, beginning on March 29th, we're actually going to amend our Eucharistic liturgy, working with our bishop, in order to include this prayer, a prayer for spiritual communion, inside of the liturgy. We'll have a liturgy of the Word, just as we have been having, but we'll also add a liturgy of spiritual communion that will sort of culminate in this prayer. And again, I encourage you to practice this with us as a form of both meditation and lamentation, that we cannot be together, that our communion together is actually impaired in this very difficult season. And to pray this prayer together is going to draw us more deeply into devotion to Jesus, and it's also going to make us aware, I hope, of what we're missing with our friends, with our church family, what we're missing in our conversations with our coworkers, with our colleagues, with our neighbors, with our family members, with everyone that we do ministry to on a daily and weekly basis, and will help us to appreciate it all the more. So I encourage you to join us on Sunday mornings as we practice spiritual communion together, and I would encourage you to take that liturgy that we practice on Sunday mornings and to meditate upon it during the week and to pray this prayer and to grow in your devotion to Jesus Christ.